let's do it. You know that argument about, so there was that discussion in the Reason chapter on just because something can happen doesn't mean you can say in this specific instance it might be possible. Like if it's, for example, if it's possible for man, I think the argument was something like, oh, well, one example was like, if you know men are capable of murder, then that doesn't mean that your friend might be a murderer. Like that's not a proper use of reason, because you need evidence in any specific given case. But then where I'm not sure is like at one, we say, okay, man, logic is necessary, but it's not necessarily a sufficient condition for reaching truth. Because even if you apply volition in full, you can make an error, right? Like you can miss knowledge. So then why would it, in that case, be arbitrary to say you might be wrong? Because there was a whole discussion on that saying, well, it's no such thing as you might be wrong. That's arbitrary. You need evidence. But if we know that, if we know using logic doesn't necessarily always result in truth, it's just a necessary condition, not a sufficient one, then why can't you say that person might be wrong?
Well, I usually would think as being right or wrong as a evaluation of the way you reach a conclusion. Or I'm thinking about it like, okay, you could say you don't necessarily know if you have the absolute truth in the sense that you're omniscient, that you can verify it across time and space at all moments. It's not like you can test it in the future. You can reach contextual certainty, of course.
Yeah.
But it might not necessarily be. There's a difference between recognizing what's true and attaining the truth. I mean, sure, logic is necessary to attain what the truth is, but it's not that it. I'm trying to think of a good way to answer this. I mean, you could say that logic has not provided a sufficient evidence or given you all the information that might change what you say. It's not that the logic was erroneous when you applied it, but that erroneous things or erroneous logic sure is one way to fail to reach the truth. Another way is not recognizing a lack of context, or just not having context that you discover later was necessary. So you could say the failure in that sense is that, well, just that you're not omniscient. And if you have an actual reason to say, I might not have all the information, then it would be arbitrary to say, well, I could be wrong. Like, what you could be wrong about? You could say, well, I need to know how this applies in, say, how would it apply 300 years ago? But if you're like asking about physics, like, oh, how do I know this law applied 300 years ago? What if it's only true today and it wasn't true 3 years ago and 300 years ago? And it'd say, well, I could be wrong. That would seem like an arbitrary way of denying what you could have known, or an arbitrary way of saying what you could have been erroneous about. You have no reason to say that just 300 years ago everything was different. It's not really how you constructed your understanding of reality or physics, or understanding contextual certainty would point to the idea that like these laws of physics don't change across time. Just 300 years ago, 3,000 years ago, the same laws would still apply. And that would be an arbitrary thing to say, well, I could be wrong. They could change every 10 years.
Right.
That would seem arbitrary.
Okay. I guess I'd need to think of a concrete example where logic would apply and someone made an error, but because I'm sitting here in the abstract talking about, well, it's possible to make an error, but therefore in any given instance, someone may be wrong. I think the error in my question is that I need a specific example.
Yeah, I
Otherwise you
mean,
can just talk in, you're talking in the abstract and it's not necessarily reducible. And so I'm asking questions that are not. Yeah.
I mean, the point is potential, that there's a potential to be misunderstood or a potential to get it wrong. The
Right.
same way maybe glass is a potential to be broken, but it doesn't mean it is broken, just because it
Right.
has potential to be broken. You have to think about in what way you would expect that it met these conditions to become broken, or in this case, met the conditions to know it's true. For us, for our knowledge, we can say contextual certainty. We could say that's the sort of truth we've attained, but we can't say we've attained the truth as in truth apart from consciousness.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if that's a way you would conceptualize in objectivism. You wouldn't really want to think in terms of the truth detached from consciousness. Maybe we could say, because there's qualities of something that don't rely on your consciousness, say the mass of an object doesn't depend on your awareness of it. In the same way, the fact that something has mass doesn't depend on you being conscious of that fact. But it's almost irrelevant to epistemology if you can't measure that, or if you can't um, relate your consciousness to it. I mean, that's where it gets tricky. How do you, what do you categorize it as? We categorize it as truth, and I find it difficult.
Um, what about, can you reach, so if I understand that this difference between contextual certainty and a view of certainty that's omniscient or absolute, but can you, are there situations in reality where you can reach some conclusion within a context and you apply logic in full volitionally, you choose to apply it at every step of the way and you still get the wrong answer? Or you still get an answer that is false within that context?
Within the context, let's see, could you reach a result that's false without making an error? Well, I think if you've attained contextual certainty to recognize what's true, you could say that there's no reason to expect you to be wrong. That you
Okay.
can't be wrong without making a mistake. That if you're
Okay.
wrong in your contextual certainty, you either misapplied, well, that'd be an error too. You've misapplied what you know.
Right.
So I would say that it's not sufficient just to use logic to reach the truth. I mean, the truth isn't determined by even whether you've been able to attain it, except we can say that you know you can attain it. But I think you're right that you couldn't have contextual certainty and fail to reach knowledge unless you made a mistake.
But it's such a bizarre, when I try and relate it to on a personal level, that idea, it's bizarre because to think that every mistake I made was due to not volitionally applying identification of contradictions it's just bizarre because you don't experience it as such. Like as I look back at mistakes I may have made, I'm not like, oh, okay, I just refuse to pay attention to reality, that's why I was wrong. Like you know what I'm saying? When you try to apply it to the personal level, it's like, well, every mistake you've made was a misapplication of, was your refusal to well, not a refusal. It could have been a refusal or a default to look out at reality, which yeah, it's just so bizarre. That doesn't sit with me.
Or I think it could just be simply that you integrated the facts in. Well, what would it mean to integrate the facts incorrectly? Maybe you could say that you were just missing. But I would say then that if you don't have absolute conceptual certainty, or if you don't have conceptual certainty or contextual certainty, then any error or not reaching the truth is just a matter of not having enough information.
Yeah, although you could act with that in mind, and then that would completely change the nature of your error. Like the error would be much smaller. But it's also bizarre because bizarre not on it when I speak in the abstract without much thought as to its relationship to actual events. It's not bizarre, but when I try and relate it to and other things, like, okay, well, if that's true, then well, everyone has defaulted on reality except for Aristotle and a few other philosophers and Ayn Rand, and like, so that's it's also bizarre in that sense. He's like, well, is that true? Just on that level, it doesn't. It's yeah.
Maybe we have to think in the ways that you could get things wrong. I mean, well, what brought this question on? Like, you're saying that how come I can't just always say I could be wrong, since we're fallible? Then couldn't I say that about everything I know? Right? Is that what we were asking originally?
Well, the motivation in asking this question is I remember reading somewhere that you can apply and use logic with your full volition. You're constantly paying attention to reality, but you'll still end up with, I guess I need it. That's why I was saying I need an example. You can still end up with the wrong conclusion, even if you're fully logical. And I was like, well, if that's true, then why is it wrong to say you might be wrong without further evidence?
Without further evidence. Okay.
But
thinking.
I need to think it over more too. So, but it's still like a cactus in my thought process.
You would need an example for sure to
Yeah,
make
okay.
this clear. You might be wrong without any further evidence.
Have you read the essay "The Metaphysical versus the Man-Made"?
Yeah, I remember it pretty well.
Okay.
Actually.
Did you spend a while going through it?
I don't really think so.
Don't think so. I tried to read it today pretty slowly,
Yeah.
and there's something there's one, I don't know if you'll remember, so, but I'll mention it anyway. She talks about the root issue in philosophy is she says it's the primacy of existence, and its antithesis is the primacy of consciousness. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And she's saying that the failure to what was she saying? I'm just trying to remember. So what is it? There's primacy of consciousness, and then there's what are the corollaries of the primacy of existence and I don't know. I need to look at it. But she was saying like the inability of people to, like, if someone, to the extent that someone doesn't accept the primacy of consciousness, it's due to their inability to introspect and tell and grasp the difference between their inner world and their outer world. And what got me in that is, so I understand that if I like try and bend a spoon with my mind and it doesn't bend, and I still conclude that the world, if I'm still sort of somewhat acting on the primacy of consciousness, then there's some issue then, either my inability or refusal to introspect and observe that there's a difference between my inner and outer world. But she lumps belief in God and the supernatural in that same category. So she in the same category. So in the sense that she's saying that people who believe in the supernatural or God are making, it's the same basic error of the inability or refusal to introspect and notice the difference between their inner and outer world. So I understand in the former case, like if you're saying your own consciousness has primacy, like that would be an error of, and the error would be the inability to introspect or the refusal to do so. But when it comes to like a supernatural God, that's not, I don't see the connection at all there to like, okay, so if someone asks who created the universe, it's a sign of their inability to introspect or grasp the difference between their inner and outer world. Like to me, that connection, like I just cannot, I don't get how that works. I found it very interesting, but I just don't, I cannot, my mind cannot jump and go, oh, okay, yeah, obviously that's the inability to introspect.
I think that's really stretching it on Rand's account there. Like, I'm sure it can happen. And maybe the more, maybe say the Pope or something like that, maybe you could say that about them. But I don't know if you would say that about, say, the average Christian. I think in many cases you couldn't just say they believe because they can't distinguish between their inner world and outer world, or that they refuse to distinguish. Maybe on some level you could say that they have, or on some level that they, even though they acknowledge that maybe there's certain facts that there's what God wants and what they want, they could distinguish God's will versus their own will, but they might not be able to distinguish consciousness from reality per se. And I think in a way they could be saying or denying that existence is not an aspect of consciousness, that existence itself is not a type of consciousness, something like that. Usually, but I don't think you could directly say that it's their own primacy of consciousness, that they put their own desires and will and just awareness as the determinant of reality, as much as they're saying that existence isn't the primary, but some conscious will of somebody.
Right.
I'm not sure we really could say it the way Rand did, that they are completely lost it. They do have some understanding of reality, but we could say it's not as strong primacy of existence. They're not putting existence itself as a primary. Like even a friend of mine who's Christian, he definitely said that like reality has primacy of consciousness, like in the sense that God created the universe and of existence, and it was his consciousness that did it. Nothing about existence, but just merely his willpower, which is kind of like primacy of consciousness, but not the same as, say, an emotionalist who just throws a tantrum every time he doesn't get what he wants.
Yeah, that's what I mean. But she didn't say it's an one extreme or another. I do think that there's the spectrum, but it seems like she's saying that the basic cause in both cases is the same, which I just couldn't see. And I actually pasted it here and I bolded the parts that are relevant. So you can see, you know, and even in the example you gave, I can also think of like someone who believes in God, but then still, you know, doesn't think they can magically change the world. So I guess the connection I'm having trouble with is that it's due to a inability to grasp the difference between the inner and outer world. Like, so here she's, okay, the basic axioms, so primacy of existence, that and law of identity, and then okay, so the epistemological corollary is the fact that consciousness is the faculty of perceiving that which exists. And then she goes on to speak about the opposites of primacy of consciousness and man gaining knowledge of reality by looking inward, or at the revelations it received from another superior consciousness. So that's not someone who believes in God.
Let's try to break it down more. So let's say primacy of existence. She defines it, blah blah blah, and man gains knowledge by reality. Man gains knowledge of reality
by looking outward. Yeah.
It's a rejection of these axioms. Let's say if you are a Christian, like you could reject those in different degrees. You might not reject everything, but you would probably reject that consciousness is the faculty of perceiving that which exists, because they would believe God is conscious. I mean, that's a basic belief, like is some conscious entity
Yeah.
that pre-existed, that created reality. We could take that. So
Yeah.
at the very least, that's what they're accepting, or the axiom that they're rejecting.
Yeah.
They might accept everything else.
Yeah. Existence wouldn't, yeah, it makes sense. Existence for them doesn't have primacy.
Yeah. And the notion that the universe has no independent existence. So we could just say that consciousness itself, a consciousness created existence.
Yeah.
But a consciousness preceded existence. You could say it, primacy in the literal sense. It came first.
Yeah.
And it would be, that is the product of a consciousness, either human or divine. So
Yes.
say the product of a divine consciousness.
Yeah.
So at least at the very least, there are some class of things that there's something about reality that can precedes existence, that is conscious and is divine, even that precedes all of these things about reality. And it's that faculty of consciousness, whatever it is, isn't perceiving that which exists, because it created that which exists.
Yeah.
It's not just perceiving it, like
Yeah.
it's just outside of those sort of rules, or
Yeah.
outside of that thinking. So the corollary of that, like how do you gain knowledge of reality in that case, if there's something about reality that only this consciousness has? So we can say, put aside science, say they accept that you can find out how germs work and get you sick. Just suppose they just know that. But at the same time, they would say that there's some things about reality that are, say, just mere consciousness, that they're not even aspects of reality or a way to see reality, but something that precedes reality. In what way could you even attain that knowledge or find it or understand it? And I think Rand is claiming that the only thing you could do is go inward.
Yeah.
Either revelation, or assume those revelations are from a consciousness that is above theirs, or just take their own consciousness as the determining factor of what's true or not. Like, I feel God is true, therefore he is. Because I can't prove it, but he is. He isn't part of existence in the usual sense. I don't need to verify it, I just feel it within. I think that's the sort of process Brenda's talking about, just assuming here that they think there's something that precedes existence that's conscious.
Okay. But then, so if you, I can see how if you looked within and came to that conclusion that God existed, then that would be maybe it's still a stretch for me to concretize exactly how this would work, but I can sort of see that might be an inability or unwillingness to grasp the difference between an inner state and outer world. Because you can see it, look at the next thing that I bolded. The source of this reversal, so in both cases, is the inability or unwillingness to grasp the difference. The blending consciousness and existence into one indeterminate package deal. And then she goes on, it's not given automatically. And here she goes, what you're talking about, there's inconsistency, and she recognizes that. Majority keeps swinging from side to side, and different issues, hit or miss, rule of thumb. But anyway, going back to this, what you were discussing, where I have trouble is if someone is like looking out at the world and he does identify like things are in general created, like he can see like women give birth, the baby doesn't come from nowhere, it comes from somewhere. He can see animals give birth, he can see what else might he see that, I don't know, there's thunderstorms, and he recognizes there's some pattern of like things, there's causes of things. And so he jumps to conclude, okay, well, you know, maybe it's the rain god or maybe it's the thunder god. And like, to me, and there's this person who does things like, I have more trouble seeing how that is the result of issue with introspection as opposed to an issue with just developing good hypotheses without the guide of logic. Like, I just like to bring it all down to introspection. To me, is I just don't. I'm having trouble with that. I still, even with your example.
Yeah, I wouldn't buy either that it's always just an unwillingness, because I think it could be,
Or an inability. Also inability, she said.
Yeah, I wouldn't put it only that, because I think sometimes there are ways to conceptualize God that don't imply these sort of things necessarily. It depends, I think, on exactly what they think of. I mean, you might have to ask them, because Spinoza had a notion of God that it's almost like atheism. It's so weird. Spinoza, the Dutch philosopher, is practically straight atheism.
Yeah.
But in that sense, you might say, oh, that's erroneous. It's weird and erroneous, but it's not like, doesn't seem to indicate anything about difficulty of introspection, or it's more like just a weird context of knowledge or a strange way of looking at things, but not itself an unwillingness to think or distinguish inner and outer. I'm thinking the ways you could come to that notion that this consciousness precedes existence.
Well, you know, if it's true that the basic cause is introspection, then same with Aristotle. Didn't you come up with the theory of the prime mover? And so it also seems weird to say, oh, well, Aristotle failed to he had a bad ability to introspect. Like basically every single person in existence had a,
I don't think, could we really reduce it to that always? Like, even leaving aside everything they got right, with that one decision, with that one conceptualization always depend on the failure to introspect. I don't know if we could say that. There seems too many possibilities there. We can't say, if they explicitly say that there's a consciousness that precedes existence, they failed to grasp something about inner and outer. Let's just say maybe the best way to interpret her is that you can fail to, I mean, let me rephrase that yeah, those people just failed to make the distinction sufficiently. They weren't able to distinguish well enough the difference between inner and outer. They
still don't
distinguish it pretty well.
I still don't see how it has anything to do with distinguishing inner and outer.
Well,
like if it's a case of God or Aristotle or Spinoza, like how, yeah. I only see it in the case of my own consciousness, not in the case of the supernatural consciousness.
probably need to leave that one aside now.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. But it is interesting, because if it is true, then there's something wrong with most people's method of introspection. And so that should be like, the question would become, what is it and how does one introspect well? But that's the interest. It's not I don't think this is we can move on, but to me it's like, it's a pretty important point. Like, I want to know the reasoning, because that would have massive implications.
I think it has to do with introspection. I just don't know if it's a failure or things like that always. But I think it's about introspection.
I still don't see that. But anyway, we can move on. I think it's interesting. Yeah, okay. So when you think, so this is the next one here, like I'm wondering about thinking in relation to acquiring new knowledge. So thinking deals with material that's already in your head, right?
Yeah.
And it just sorry?
Is it just, yeah, I would say for the most part. I'll go with that for now.
Yeah, okay. So thinking itself isn't for acquiring knowledge, it's simply for arranging knowledge, right? Would I be correct to say that? It's not like all thinking, the function of thinking is rearrangement of knowledge.
I wouldn't say knowledge per se. Organization of concepts, or organization of organization of ideas might be the better way to put it.
Okay.
It's not necessarily knowledge, because integrate information in order to get knowledge. You could have ideas and thoughts that aren't, it could have, say, false theories and think about those, but categorize them differently. Or I could know why, or I could know why certain arguments are correct, or I know why capitalism is good, or things like that. You could arrange all that kind of information.
Sorry, I didn't get the distinction you were making. So what was wrong with saying rearranging knowledge as opposed to concepts?
Well, knowledge is something you've already integrated into something that's certain or definite.
Okay.
You believe is true.
As opposed to?
As opposed to, say, I don't know, a hypothesis.
Oh, okay.
Well, I think it's probably going to rain. I wouldn't call that knowledge, but that's the sort of claim you would think about, or you might think.
Well, I would say it's not that that's knowledge. It's the fact that there are certain pieces of knowledge that you have that lead you to conclude that it's possible or probable. So I don't know. But anyway, I mean, I guess it's a side issue.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in acquiring new knowledge, we'll just go for now with rearranging concepts. Would you agree with that? Like that's what the function of thinking is. It's rearranging concepts.
Rearranging mental content, like whatever it is, the representation you have of a remembering what an apple is, you can manipulate that memory, or remembering what a banana looks like, and then with that in mind, then manipulating that memory into something that's an integration to a fruit, for example.
Right.
And that would be acquiring new knowledge, I would say. That was about integration of previous mental content.
Okay. So am I capturing the essence then, like of it, if I say all thinking does is rearrangement, and so therefore
Maybe it even transforms it. I mean, a banana and an apple you would picture that completely different than fruit. I mean,
right.
Fruit is a different sort of item,
right,
representation.
right.
So in that way, you could say it's been transformed. We didn't merely move apple from left of banana to the right of banana. Like, we literally transformed what we had and made something that wasn't there before.
It goes to that, in that essay, Metaphysical versus Mathematics, he talks about creation as rearrangement of material elements to form some new whole. So it would be sort of the same thing, right? Like the creation of new knowledge is the rearrangement of pre-existing mental content in order to form some new whole.
Yeah, to form some new whole, yes.
Okay. All right. That's because it gets the reason so I wonder if the related question is close. Let me see if I can. Okay. So this is semi-related actually, and it was part of this. I was trying to get my head around. I'll paste it here. So the motivation in trying to clarify that was that, when you get stuck on something, like you ask your subconscious for an answer, but you don't seem to get one. So like for example, my personal easy but ineffective default is to just keep repeating the command. So like, for example, if I want examples of situations where the concept factor is applicable, or factors, but like it's kind of like blunt and doesn't give you anything. So it's a blank. And so what I was thinking about, and I guess it ties to this previous question, is like, how do you determine whether it's ignorance, meaning there's the lack of the mental content for you to rearrange the knowledge to form the conclusion that you need? So you need to go out and collect new knowledge, or how do you determine whether it's simply disorganization of knowledge, or maybe even contradictory concepts? Like there's there's obviously no answer for that I know of, but it's interesting to think about, because if you spend, let's say, we'll just take a day as a small example, like if you spend a whole day thinking about a concept, let's say this is a simple example, you spend the whole day thinking about a concept and you're just trying to get the answer for it, but the error you're making is that it's not an issue of disorganization that you need to prompt your subconscious to retrieve and it's just taking time. It's actually, you're missing certain amounts of mental content that you need to go out into the world and gather. Well, you've just wasted a whole day trying to find an answer from your subconscious when the actual solution is to go out into the world and gather the mental content you need. But the failure to be able to identify that is probably massive in affecting thinking.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've given this any thought, but because I don't know of anyone out there who's written about this.
Yeah, that's more of what I was thinking about that we went over with that document I made. Well, let's just take a step back a second and say the rearrangement of mental content, what Ren was saying, you see, rearranging in such a way that you like outpops new knowledge.
Yeah.
There's something new that wasn't there before. Like,
yeah,
we're talking about integration of some form, of some way of manipulating what we know already, or
mm-hmm.
manipulating what's there already. And how will we know if there's a contradiction or disorganization? I think to some extent, you don't really know. There's some degree of all of those, I think. And often, I don't think you need to know, which it is, I think.
Often what, sorry?
I don't think you often will know which it is exactly. To start out, I think you have to initially just start it with some methods of broadening your thinking, which is what I mentioned before, I think. Or depending on what the problem is, about broadening your thinking, narrowing your thinking, or changing your environment, remember?
Right.
I think those would unstuck you. Usually one being that you can trigger new memories, which would be about perhaps ignorance, because more things are striking you, or it could be that if the problem was contradiction, well, you'll get more knowledge or new evidence of stuff to use to then create something new. So it was a contradiction. Now you've got new information to use. Or if it was disorganization, you'd have more information to use to see what's related, or say, oh, I realize these are related now. I could rearrange how they're organized. And then you could follow it through, hopefully. I think those are ways to start to identify what the problem is. So you might broaden your thinking. You might then realize that you're unable to take into account some other idea that you didn't recognize. Or if you broaden your perspective, you could get unstuck by finding where the connection is, or finding a new connection while getting rid of another one.
But
do you follow what I mean?
Not really, but we'll go over it now. To get to me, stuck is a metaphor, right? Or
Yes.
It's figurative. So to me, I guess if I wanted to be literal, then to get unstuck would be to identify the source, the problem causing the lack of progress on whatever it is you want to progress on. So identifying, is there some contradiction in a concept that I'm using to think about this? Or am I lacking content for one of the concepts? Or is it simply that there is material in my subconscious, but it's not properly arranged? And so identifying which one it is would lead you to progress. But then what I'm stuck on, what I didn't understand from what you're saying is that what would it actually mean to broad, like even to say to broaden your thinking is figurative when we're speaking about concepts, right? Because what would it mean to, for example, step back on this paragraph that I've just written? I'm not sure
Literally
how.
step back, like literally get up.
All right, I'm gonna stand across the room. Yeah.
Or somewhere, I don't know, I never really tried it, but it should at least get you to, by moving, you're getting your mind to go in a different place and go in a different frame of mind.
But how does that help you identify if, for example, there is some material in your subconscious or not, and it's just a matter of prompting it with the right words? Like, I don't. I it's okay because I don't think we may not have an answer to this, but this is something I've been thinking about a lot because I imagine if you could be really good at identifying it, then you I don't know, you might be a genius.
An example might be hold it at arm's length, might be enough to just change your mind. I mean, it might sound
Hold it
odd.
arm length.
Arm length, yeah.
All right, so
Physical.
my arm is in front of the PC now.
I'm not sure. Trying to think what. Well, also would depend on.
Well, what is it? I mean, I guess the question would be, okay, so when you say hold it arm length or step back, what does your mind do? Like in this, let's use this as an example on itself. So what is it, if you tell yourself, I'm going to step back on this, what does that mean?
The objective.
What does your mind do? What does your mind do is basically the.
Well, say if it were a perceptual problem that you were trying to do a word, I don't know, a word find. And if you're looking close to it, it's hard to see. So you have to literally pull it away so your eyes can scan it faster. It would seem that by doing that same sort of process, that your mind would be preparing itself to take a broader look at this information here. That it would mirror that in a way that by physically moving yourself when using your eyes in a more wide open way, like that in a more broad, big picture way, that would get your mind focused on, even conceptually within your memory, to go wide in searching through information, and your subconscious even.
Isn't that the equivalent of to think in principles?
Pretty similar.
Or like, I actually, to be honest, I'm not even sure. I'm not fully clear on the difference between to think in fundamentals and principles, because to me, it would be like you step back on this paragraph. To think in fundamentals would be identifying what's the key question or what's the key concept or point that everything turns on. And to think in principles would be similar. Like what's the key principle that everything turns like,
Right.
yeah, but
that's probably fine to think of it in those terms. For you, I think it's probably appropriate to do that. Just consider them the same thing and just use narrow and broad instead of the principle versus fundamental that I was using.
Right. Right. Okay.
Right. The idea is, I mean, that's more psychology, of course, because recognizing that it is such a thing that changing your perceptual environment will change your thinking habits, at least at that time, at that moment in time. Or like we said, thinking in wider context or in the future or distant times or distant places can help you think more broadly to get unstuck, in the sense that you're changing your frame of thinking. That you might then discover what the problem was. It's about just looking at your concepts differently, I think, is what largely occurs. There's probably other techniques to then say examine, is it a contradiction? But at least at the broad technique of getting unstuck and just finding a new path.
I don't see how, if I change my environment, I can see how that might prompt different subconscious material to come up. But I don't see how it'll change my thinking habits. Because remember, we discussed habit a while ago, and I was trying to define it, and you were like, okay, the essence of habit is repetition. But if you're in a new environment, your thinking habits would be what you would.
Alters your focus, alters your frame of focus, or your frame of mind. It alters where you're focusing, or the way you are focusing at that moment in time. Like we were talking before about, you control your focus. Is it broad or is it narrow? How do you decide which to use? How do you know which way to change your focus? It's not merely an off-on thing, but even if it's on, then what are the different ways we can use focus? We can use it in a broad, big picture sense, or we can use it in a narrow, very analytical sense. And both are valid depending on the problem. So it's not that it'll change your habits, but it's a matter of practicing how to use your focus. As it taking it beyond the level of just, do you choose to focus or not? Or beyond just, do you raise your level of focus to low to high? In what ways can you use your focus? So it's like skill with focus. is what I'm talking about.
Okay. I still don't. I would have to go properly to an example, but okay, maybe I can give you an example. The example of factors was an actual one. Like I was trying to clarify that as a concept, and it took me a while to come up with. Well, I couldn't even come up with really nice examples. Really, I came up with a few, but the question for me at the time was, well, how long do I spend trying to rack my brain or my subconscious for answers? And it's not obvious because you could spend 30 minutes and then decide, okay, well, 30 minutes, I guess this is personal too, because you'd have to decide for yourself.
Yeah.
If you spend 30 minutes and you're like, well, I'm not getting answers here, it probably means I need to get, like, it's an issue of ignorance rather than one of disorganization. But you're saying that in addition to that, you could actually just say, all right, well, I'm going to, if you're doing something, you could go to a cafe and then go to some other place, and it may just jumble your like bring up different material that might, but that seems so hit or miss though, you know, like, all right, let me just think about factors. So I'm going to go drink some coffee at a cafe.
Yeah, it's hard to break it all apart. It's just, that's why it's important to distinguish when to use each of these, not just a random, I'm going to take a walk, because you're right, that's hit or miss. It generally works, but it is hit or miss because it's no uniformity to it. It's just random what happens.
Right.
You could be more focus driven, or you could be more goal driven in the way you use that. Right. I think you're right to say that sometimes just time might be a way to indicate whether it's just, say, disorganization. Like if you take a while, well, that would indicate one thing.
It's that plus I can see where Rand's, I think she said something like, a mind is only as sharp as its concepts. I don't know if do you know that quote?
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, so if the concepts are the fundamental building blocks of thought, then that's the beginning of everything of efficient thinking. Yeah. And Alain de Botton, who runs the School of Life, was writing something about how he often writes very figuratively. He's definitely not as precise, and he writes a lot about emotions and all that kind of stuff. But he wrote that sometimes in order to get the right subconscious material, this is my paraphrasing because I think he meant this in a different context, but it amounts to the same thing. If you need material from your subconscious, it's like you're going to run through your mind with a butterfly net, because the content is labeled differently for different people. So you've got to prompt yourself with all kinds of random things that are semi-related, like vague family resemblances, in order to fish out the correct material. So that was one other thing. But yeah, I mean, it's a problem, and I can see how my interest is that, okay, there's this feeling sometimes of you get stuck on a thought, like you've probably experienced this, right? Like not on a thought, you get stuck on trying to get an answer to something, like, what should I do? What is an example of this? And you can't think of one. And so my interest is that I'm curious if the experience of thinking should often be one where you do get stuck, or if you were thinking efficiently, it's not that you would never get stuck even for 1 second, but the stuckness would prompt you to then ask a question that would get your thought process moving again, like a smooth running train, rather than a train that's constantly shutting down and like has to have engineers come on and like fix it, or just get stuck and you abandon it in the middle of the night. So that's my interest. I think that's pretty motivating, like to think that it might be possible to get your thought processes and thinking running like a smooth hyperloop train, rather than an old coal freight.
Yeah, I think yes, that's possible, and I think it is normal to get stuck a lot. I think that's quite normal.
Well, there's normal as in a common statistical experience, but is it reasonable for someone who has a good and correct epistemology to frequently experience long bouts of pronounced stuckness?
How much do you mean by frequent?
Well,
I mean,
Okay, so like frequent would be you go to one problem. Like I'll give you a personal example since it's hard. If I'm just making one up, it's going to be hard. Okay, let's say I'm clarifying concepts, and like factor was an example, conditions, any concept, really abstract concept, and I sit there and trying to go, okay, let my brain. I want. What are some examples I can think of? And I can just sit there for like 20 minutes, and my examples are crap, or I can't think of any, and it's hard for me to tell whether there's appropriate content or not, and or what to do. Like, should I just keep sitting there trying, or like what should I do next? There's no answer. But if I can imagine, that would be to me frequent stuckness, versus I sat there and I'm like, okay, let me give examples. All right, nothing is coming up. What's my next step? All right, let me do that. Okay, that didn't work. What's my next step? Let me do that. As opposed to uh so that would be an experience where there's no frequent stuckness. The stuckness immediately prompts the next action step. But frequent stuckness would be you get stuck and you go, okay, give me an example, give me an example. And you keep repeating the same thing and it's not working. You know what I
I
mean?
see. I see what you mean. Yeah, I think, okay, the way you're describing it, that would almost sound like banging your head against the wall, like you said about requesting your subconscious for information
Yeah,
repeatedly over
exactly.
and over and over. No, I don't think that would be a rational way to do it.
It's
The
like a,
experience of being stuck, like, oh, I don't know what to do now. But you're right. I think it usually amount to, well, what do I do next? Which
well, it
sometimes it might
should.
be
I mean,
easy
that's what I'm thinking. It should, right? So,
not to. Yeah, that might not reveal the answer for a while. But I think I've read a lot about ways writers get unstuck. When they have writer's block, it's like, I don't know what to do. And they can't just force themselves to do it. So what they do to deal with it, they don't, the answer isn't to think more about it, is to stop, interestingly enough. And I think most people describe how they deal with their, I don't know, many creative things I've read about have to do with how people deal with when ideas aren't coming and what
right,
they need to do so they aren't experiencing the stuckness all the time, that they
right,
just make do with. And just, I think that will happen a lot. And you can't expect that the answers must be found immediately, but that the answers take, sometimes just waiting, oddly enough, even though you wish you could just say, I want to think it to be until it's solved, but it doesn't always work that way. So
well,
it
I mean,
can't work.
that's the question. Is there, should there be waiting or not? Which is, there's a difference between saying I'm stuck, I just need to wait, or I need to go do something and let my subconscious bring it up, or just keep writing and writing and writing, and eventually my subconscious will create something, versus saying, all right, here's my next step. It doesn't mean you get it done immediately. It could mean, hey, I need to go fly to Mexico and spend a month there to investigate this thing. And so that's
Yeah.
going to take you a month, but you have a next step. But there's a difference
Yeah.
between that versus just saying, I just got to wait, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's when you need to take action. Like even Stephen King says, like, he takes a walk if he gets stuck and just waits for, say wait, I'm not saying waiting, but just he changes what he's doing. He does something else, or does something profound happens that makes see, the guy who discovered a certain arrangement of molecules called the benzene molecule. He had a
Yeah.
dream and about snakes, and the answer came to him. And it
Oh,
was when
wow,
he was
cool.
answering. It was weird how it came to him, but it was
Yeah.
just in a dream. But he wasn't continuing to work on it necessarily, just that he did other things that might be tangentially related. And just it just appears one day. Because you can't necessarily know if it's
But
contradiction, ignorance, or disorganization. So you keep gaining information,
well, I mean,
keep gaining
that's your
knowledge.
claim. That's your claim.
Yes.
That's what that was my question. Right? So you're saying you can't know. I'm saying I don't know that you can't know. I don't see why that necessarily has to be the case.
You could, I
That's
think,
my experience. I have the same experience as what you're describing, but I'm curious if that has to be the case.
is it contradiction, ignorance, or disorganization that's causing it? Is that what you're asking?
Of stuckness, yeah.
Well, I'd have to investigate that more. I haven't
Me
decided which of
too.
these it is. But I
But
do
don't
know it can be dealt with for sure.
you do know it can be dealt with.
yeah, I'm sure about that, that there's rational ways to
Right.
overcome these things, even if I don't know exactly
Right.
which it is, because I think the solution to all of these is the same sort of thing. Even if they're different problems, the prescription is still the same.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. Anyway, I guess we're at a. Oh, let me just stop
Like
this.
there's a strong connection between contradiction, ignorance, and disorganization. I think you'll be disorganized because you have a contradiction or ignorance, or that you're
Yes.
ignorant because you're disorganized and you have a contradiction. Not necessarily
Interesting.
as
Right.
one-to-one thing, but they're all related concepts. And to
Ah,
have
yeah,
one
yeah.
implies the other.
You're right. That I didn't think about that. So if you're disorganized, you might be led to more contradictions than if you weren't disorganized.
Yes.
All right, let me